The auction signs had already been printed. After 93 years in the same family, the Harper dairy farm was about to belong to someone else. The debts had grown too large, the milk prices had stayed too low for too long, and there wasn't enough money left in the account to carry the herd through another winter. Ethan Harper had already made peace with it. He wasn't looking for a miracle. Men who grow up on land like this learn early that miracles aren't a farming strategy. He was only trying to clear out the old hayloft before strangers walked through it with clipboards and appraisal forms. That's when his boot crashed through a rotten section of the floor. For a moment he hung there, one leg through splintered wood, dust raining down into the empty stall below, heart hammering from the drop that almost was. And when he pulled himself free and looked down into the gap he'd made, he saw it, beneath decades of dust and old hay, wedged between two support beams, sat a small rusted metal box. At first the papers inside looked worthless, yellowed, brittle, tied together with twine that crumbled at the touch. 3 weeks later, those forgotten papers stopped the auction and changed the future of the farm forever. Ethan Harper had grown up believing the farm would always be there. Not because anyone told him so directly. It was simply the shape of the world, as a child understands it. The sun rises, the cows get milk, and the Harper land sits where it has always sat, at the end of County Road 9, framed by the tree line and the slow bend of Miller's Creek. His grandfather, Walt Harper, had built the original barn with 3 neighbors in the spring of 1961, back when a barn raising was still something a community did together, instead of something you hired out. Ethan had heard the story 100 times, how they'd finished the frame in a single weekend, how his grandfather had climbed the ridge beam himself to nail down the final board, because he didn't trust anyone else to do it right. His father, Daniel Harper, had expanded the milking parlor in the early 1980s, adding stalls and a new cooling tank when the herd outgrew the old setup. Ethan remembered being 6 years old, riding on his father's shoulders through the construction dust, asking 100 questions his father patiently half answered. Every fence post, every gravel lane, every warped board in the hayloft carried some memory. Birthdays celebrated in the yard, summer storms that flooded the lower pasture, harvests that stretched past dark, mornings that began hours before sunrise because the cows didn't care whose turn it was to be tired. But farming had changed, the way it always does, quietly, and then all at once. Feed prices climbed every season. Equipment repairs piled up faster than Ethan could pay them down. A blown hydraulic line on the tractor, a cracked bearing on the manure spreader, a roof leak over the milking parlor that worsened every time it rained. Milk prices, meanwhile, did the opposite. They dropped and stayed low no matter how efficient he tried to become. Then Daniel Harper died, a heart attack in the equipment shed on an ordinary Tuesday in March. The kind of death that leaves no room to prepare. At only 31 years old, Ethan inherited the farm, and every unpaid bill that came with it. For nearly 4 years, he fought to hold everything together. He learned to repair tractors instead of replacing them, teaching himself from grainy tutorial videos late at night after the herd was fed. He patched leaking roofs with salvaged tin pulled from a collapsed shed 2 farms over. He stopped paying himself a real wage, funneling every spare dollar back into keeping the cows healthy and the operation breathing. Still, the numbers refused to work. He sat at the kitchen table some nights with a calculator and a legal pad, running the same math over and over, hoping a different answer might appear if he was patient enough. It never did. Eventually, the letter came from the bank. Formal language, certified mail, a date circled in red that Ethan didn't need circled. He already knew it by heart before he opened the envelope. Final notice. The property would be auctioned in 30 days. Word travels fast in a small farming community, and within a week, half the county knew the Harper place was going to auction. People were kind about it in the careful sideways way people are kind when they don't know what else to say. A few dropped off casseroles. One old friend of his father's, Russell Combs, stopped by just to sit on the porch with him for an hour without saying much at all. "Take what you can carry," Russell finally told him, staring out at the pasture. "Photos. Your daddy's tools. Don't torture yourself trying to save what can't be saved, son. You've done all you could." Ethan appreciated it. He even believed it mostly. But he couldn't walk away without cleaning the place his family had spent 93 years building. It felt like the last thing he could still control, not the debt, not the bank, not the calendar counting down to auction day. Just this, making sure the barn wasn't handed over full of junk and forgotten corners. So every evening after the milking was done, he worked through the property room by room, box by box. Most of what he found was exactly what he expected. Rusted milk cans nobody had used since the 70s. Fencing wire coiled in the corner of the equipment shed. Broken kerosene lanterns from an era before the farm had reliable electricity. A drawer full of mismatched bolts that had probably outlived 3 tractors. Then he climbed the ladder into the hayloft. The space had been sealed off for years, too unstable for regular use. Floorboards warped from decades of humidity and old leaks nobody had ever properly fixed. Dust hung visible in the shafts of late afternoon light angling through the gaps in the siding. The kind of light that made the whole loft look like something out of an old photograph. The floor creaked under every step. Ethan moved carefully, testing each board before committing his weight to it, working his way toward the far corner where loose hay had once been stored decades ago. He never made it that far. One board gave way beneath him without warning. No creak of caution, no slow give, just a sudden crack and the sensation of the floor disappearing. His leg dropped straight through to the knee. Splintered wood scraped his shin. For a half second, adrenaline flooding through him. He genuinely believed he might fall clean through to the stalls below. He caught himself on a support beam, breath ragged, heart pounding against his ribs. And as he pulled his leg free and looked down into the hole he'd just made, something caught the light. Wedged tightly between 2 heavy support beams, placed there deliberately, not fallen there by accident, sat a small metal cash box, its surface eaten through with rust. Ethan sat on the loft floor for a long moment before he even reached for it. The box was heavier than it looked, its hinges frozen solid, the lock long since corroded into uselessness. When he finally pried the lid open with the flat edge of a screwdriver, the smell of old paper and dust rose up to meet him. Inside were faded photographs, people he didn't recognize, standing in front of a barn that might have been this one decades before he was born. A leather-bound notebook, its pages soft with age, filled with handwriting, too faded in places to read. Tax receipts dated from the 1950s, the numbers on them almost comically small by today's standards. Near the bottom, a folded envelope sealed with a strip of brittle tape, marked in careful, deliberate handwriting. Property records. Do not destroy. Ethan almost set the whole box aside. He was exhausted. His shin was bleeding through his jeans, and he had 100 other things demanding his attention, with 30 days on the clock. Old family photographs weren't going to save the farm, but something about that handwriting, the do not destroy, stopped him. He carried the box down the ladder and into the house. That night, after the herd was fed and the house had gone quiet, he spread the contents across the kitchen table under the single overhead light. Same table he'd run his hopeless calculations 100 times before. One document immediately caught his attention. It was an original land survey, hand-drawn and dated decades before modern digital county records existed. The kind of document that predated GPS coordinates and satellite mapping entirely, when boundaries were still measured by chain and compass and marked with iron stakes in the ground. Ethan studied it for a long time, comparing it against what he remembered of the current property lines. Something didn't match. According to this old survey, the Harper farm's boundary extended beyond Miller's Creek, an additional tract of land that, as far as Ethan knew, had never appeared on any modern county map he'd ever seen. He pulled up the county's digital records on his laptop, cross-referencing the parcel numbers. The tract beyond the creek wasn't there. Not folded into a neighboring property, not listed separately, simply absent, as if it had never existed at all. First instinct was that the old survey was simply outdated, superseded decades ago by newer, more accurate records. That happened all the time with land this old. Still, something about it bothered him enough that he couldn't put it down. Late as it was, he made one phone call. The man on the other end of the line was Walter Pruitt, a local land surveyor who'd worked the county for over 20 years and had surveyed half the farms in the valley at one point or another, including a fence line dispute for Ethan's father back when Ethan was still in grade school. Walter agreed to come out and compare the old documents against the current county records himself. It took him several days. He cross-checked the hand-drawn 1950s survey against historical plat maps, old tax assessment ledgers pulled from the courthouse archive, and the county's current digital parcel system, a process slower and more tedious than Ethan had expected. But Walter was thorough in a way that made Ethan trust him more with every passing day. When Walter finally called back, his voice carried the careful tone of a man who wasn't entirely sure how the news would land. "Ethan," he said, "there may have been an error made years ago, a significant one." He explained it slowly, methodically. The way a man explains something he wants to make sure is understood correctly the first time. Decades earlier, likely sometime in the late 1960s or early 1970s, when several neighboring farms were consolidated and their records digitized into the county's newer filing system, one section of the Harper property had been mistakenly left off the updated file. A clerical oversight, almost certainly. The kind of small human error that happens constantly during large-scale record transfers and almost never gets caught. The track beyond the creek simply fell through the cracks. For a period of years afterward, the Harper family had apparently continued paying property taxes on that land anyway. The old assessment records Walter had pulled from the courthouse showed it clearly, line after line, year after year, before the parcel quietly vanished from later paperwork entirely, absorbed into rounding errors and outdated ledgers that nobody ever bothered to reconcile. Nobody had noticed. Not Ethan, not his father Daniel, who likely never had reason to dig through 50-year-old survey documents, not even the bank whose own records were built entirely on the flawed county file, inheriting the mistake without ever knowing it existed. The forgotten deeds pulled from the Hayloft, the original survey, the historical tax receipts, the notarized property description in that leather notebook together proved something the modern records didn't. Continuous, unbroken ownership of land that had simply been lost to a paperwork error 2 generations ago. Ethan sat with that for a long time after he hung up the phone. 30 days from auction, and the answer had been sitting 6 feet above his head in the hayloft the entire time. What followed wasn't instant, and it wasn't easy. Land disputes rarely are, even ones built on solid documentation. Walter helped Ethan file a formal petition with the county assessor's office, submitting the historical survey, the tax records, and the notarized documents from the metal box as evidence of the boundary error. An attorney Ethan could barely afford, paid partly in trade in hay and firewood, because that's simply how things still worked in a town like this, walked the case through the county's records correction process. The bank, upon learning of the pending title review, agreed to pause the foreclosure proceedings while the matter was formally verified. It wasn't generosity so much as procedure. Nobody wanted to auction a property with a boundary dispute actively working through the county system. It passed. Ethan kept milking cows every morning at 5, same as always, the uncertainty hanging over him the entire time. There were no guarantees. Old documents didn't always hold up. Errors from 50 years ago weren't always correctable. But eventually, the county officially reviewed and corrected the title. The corrected survey confirmed what that hand-drawn 1950s map had shown all along. The Harper farm legally included the additional acreage bordering Miller's Creek and further out, a stretch of frontage along the county road that had never once been reflected in modern records. That additional land, especially the road frontage, dramatically increased the property's appraised value. With the corrected valuation in hand, Ethan was able to refinance the farm's debt entirely, replacing the impossible original terms with something he could actually sustain. He made the decision to sell a small parcel along the roadside, a strip of land the family had never used for anything beyond the occasional overflow pasture. The proceeds from that single sale cleared the majority of the outstanding debt in one transaction. The auction was cancelled. The signs in the cardboard box on the kitchen counter never made it to a single fence post. Months later, visitors driving down County Road 9 noticed something different about the old Harper place. Fresh paint covered the barn his grandfather had raised with neighbors back in 1961. New fencing surrounded pastures thick with healthy grass. The milking parlor his father had expanded now ran without a single leak in the roof. The auction signs were gone, replaced eventually by nothing at all, just the farm, still standing, still Harper land, the way it had been for 93 years and counting. Inside the farmhouse, on a shelf above the kitchen table, where he'd once run hopeless calculations late into the night, Ethan kept the rusted metal box, not because it held money, not because it contained anything anyone would call treasure, but because it reminded him that sometimes the most valuable things on a farm aren't buried underground waiting to be dug up. They're forgotten in the places nobody thinks to look: a rotten floorboard, a sealed-off hayloft, a box wedged between two beams by someone decades ago who wrote, "Do not destroy," and trusted that someone someday would listen. And if Ethan Harper had walked away that day instead of climbing that ladder, if he'd taken Russell's advice and left the cleaning for someone else, the Harper family farm would have disappeared forever.